Welcome to AP Biology. This video is on plants. This phylogenetic tree that we see here shows the evolution of different traits in plants. All plants evolved from a type of green algae called Charophyceans. And the major derived character of plants, the thing that makes them different from algae, is that they are able to live up on land. The first group of plants to evolve is a group of plants called Bryophytes. Bryophytes include plants like moss. The next derived character to evolve in plants is vascular tissue. We'll find out in a little bit that that's called xylem and phloem. Xylem used to transport water, phloem used to transport sugar. Pteridophytes are plants that contain vascular tissue. A good example of a pteridophyte is a fern. The next adaptation to evolve, the next derived character, is the most important. It's the evolution of the seed. The evolution of seed plants is huge because it's the adaptation that allows plants to no longer rely on water for reproduction. Here we see the two types of seed plants. You have Gymnosperms and you have Angiosperms. They differ in their reproductive structure. Gymnosperms have cones as a reproductive structure. They're going to rely on wind to move the pollen from one cone to another cone. Angiosperms are seed plants that produce flowers, and flowers are their major reproductive structure. This video is going to concentrate mostly on angiosperms. Plants exhibit what we call alternation of generations. Every generation of a plant flip-flops from being diploid to diploid back to being haploid. The diploid generation we call the sporophyte. So the sporophyte is 2N. The sporophyte goes through the process of meiosis, and the sporophyte produces haploid spores, and these spores are going to grow into the Gametophyte generation. The Gametophyte is going to be the haploid generation. The Gametophyte produces gametes, sperm and egg. Gametes fertilize each other to produce a diploid zygote, and that zygote is going to grow into the next sporophyte generation. Even though plants have alternation of generation, in all the plants that we're going to look at, the sporophyte generation is going to be dominant. It's going to be the generation that you actually see in the plant. The Gametophyte generation of all the plants that we're going to look at, the Gametophyte is going to be extremely reduced. It's going to be a very small part of that plant. In either case, the sporophyte is diploid, the Gametophyte is haploid. Here we see some different types of angiosperms, plants that have flowers as their reproductive structure. The flower is used as a form of reproduction, or it's used in order to reproduce in angiosperms. Those gymnosperms that use cones as their reproductive structure, they rely solely on the wind to transfer pollen. However, angiosperms have a beneficial adaptation. They're going to rely on both insects and animals, as well as the wind, in order to transfer pollen from one flower to another flower. If you fast forward a little bit here, flowers are going to produce a sugary substance called nectar, and that nectar is going to attract insects like bees. It's going to attract birds like hummingbirds. And as the animals consume the nectar from one flower, the pollen is going to stick to them. And the plant's going to use those animals and those insects to transfer pollen from one plant to the other plant. Here we see a picture of the structure of a flower. This flower here contains both male and female reproductive parts. The sepals are the leaves on the flower. The petals are the colored part. The petals have a purpose. They attract pollinators. They attract the bees and the hummingbirds and the other animals over to the flower. Somewhere around this region usually is where that nectar gets produced, that sugary substance that brings the insects and the animals. The male reproductive structure is called the stamen, and the stamen has an anther and the stamen has a filament. The anther is important. The anther is the structure that is going to produce pollen. If you look at the flower as a whole, that plant is the sporophyte. And the anther is the part of the sporophyte that produces pollen. Pollen is the male gametophyte. The pollen produces the male gametes. It produces the sperm. Every pollen grain contains 2 sperm inside of it. The female reproductive structure is called the carpel. The carpel is also called the pistil. You'll see it both ways. And it has some distinct structures. It has a stigma on top, and the stigma is sticky so that the pollen adheres to it. There's a tube called the style, and at the bottom we have an ovary. Inside the ovary we find the ovule. The ovule is the female gametophyte. It produces the female gametes. It produces the eggs or the ova. Here we see how reproduction takes place in plants. Reproduction is going to involve a process called double fertilization. The pollen gets transferred from the male anther to the female stigma, and the pollen grain lands on top. When the pollen grain lands on the stigma, it's going to grow a pollen tube, and that pollen tube is going to extend down the style into the ovary, and it's going to go directly into the ovule. If you look at this ovule right here, there are multiple eggs inside. One of those eggs is really big. You see it right here, and it contains 2 nuclei. We call it polar nuclei. This one really big egg that has 2 nuclei is going to play an important role in a second. When the pollen grain lands and grows down a pollen tube, 2 sperm are going to swim down the pollen tube, and 2 sperm enter the ovule. One of those sperm is going to fertilize one of the eggs. And when the sperm fertilizes the egg, this creates that zygote, and then that zygote is going to grow into the embryo. The other sperm is going to fertilize this giant egg that has the 2 nuclei. This giant egg then goes from having 2 nuclei to having 3 nuclei. So it actually becomes triploid. This one really big cell right here that's triploid, that becomes known as the endosperm. The endosperm is going to function as the food source for the developing embryo. After all this happens, the ovule is going to become a seed. Inside the seed, you have the growing embryo, and you have the endosperm that's functioning as the food source. When the seed develops, the ovary around the seed is going to become a fruit. The fruit is a really important structure in angiosperms because the fruit is used to disperse the seeds. An animal is going to come and consume the fruit. It's going to eat the fruit, and it's going to eat the seeds along with the fruit. That seed contains inside of it the embryo, the sporophyte embryo. When that animal goes to the bathroom, the seed is going to be released, and it's going to fall into the ground. So it's kind of interesting that the ovary surrounding the ovule actually becomes the fruit. The ovule itself, with the embryo inside of it, becomes the seed. When that seed is transferred to the ground, germination takes place. Germination would be a fancy word for mitosis. The seed grows into a new plant, a new sporophyte plant. When that seed germinates, there are two different types of plants that can result. And that type of plant depends upon whether or not one or two cotyledons form. Cotyledons are the first seed leaf. It's the first leaf that's going to come out of that seed. If you produce one cotyledon, you're known as a monocot. If you produce two cotyledons, you're known as a dicot. Monocots and dicots are the two different types of angiosperms. There are a number of differences between monocots and dicots. Monocots tend to be the smaller angiosperms. Talk about orchids, grasses, lilies, palms. One thing that you'll notice with all these plants is that their veins run parallel in the leaves. Think about a blade of grass or the leaf on an orchid. If you look at their roots, they have these fibrous root systems. It's very spiderwebby. Think about what happens when you pull grass out of the ground. It's not very difficult to do, and it's not really well rooted into the ground. For that reason, monocots can't grow that big because they're not really well supported into the soil. Dicots tend to be the bigger angiosperms. They have this really thick central taproot here that's going to anchor them into the ground and will allow them to grow a lot larger. Usually a dicot has branching veins in its leaves. Here you see a really normal dicot. This is a maple tree. Most people don't realize that a lot of trees, like maple trees, they produce flowers and they produce fruit. Oak trees are another angiosperm. Or another dicot. Roses, beans, sunflowers, right? These are all dicots that can grow much larger. This concludes this video.